There is one thing you should know about going into 2024. It's Project 2025. It is an initiative organized by the Heritage Foundation, self-described conservative thinking. It is a comprehensive plan that's almost 1,000 pages that I have read so you don't have to, aimed at reshaping the federal government's executive branch, which would give the president broader and more extensive powers than what is described in the Constitution. They claim that this can be done using a legal theory that basically gives the president the ability to act without the consent of Congress based on a really out there interpretation of Article 2, the part of the Constitution that says what a president's role is and what he can and cannot do, a theory that's also been rejected by the Supreme Court. Part of their plan includes firing all civil servants who can only be rehired if they've submitted to an intensive and very intrusive background check of everything, including their social media accounts, regardless of the position, and that they take a loyalty oath to the president, not just the Constitution, but the president. Also discusses the president, not Congress, but the president cutting most federal government departments and moving them in a way that essentially would allow the president to make all decisions, regardless of the department, regardless of its function. Before getting into Project 2025 in another video series, we need to understand the Heritage Foundation and why it was created, some of its original purposes and intentions, to give the background as to why Project 2025 is something you really need to worry about going into the 2024 election season. Politicians are taking the advice of these quote-unquote research studies from conservative think tanks and turning them into policies that control our lives. This was one of the sole purposes of the Heritage Foundation and why it was created. In May of 2021, Mother Jones reported on a leaked recording of a private meeting of big money donors at a Heritage Foundation event. In the leaked video, an executive from the group boasted that her outfit had crafted some of the new voter suppression laws in Georgia and was doing the same with similar bills for Republican state legislatures across the country.
Recommendations, but we have honed in on these 8 specific focus states because they are battleground states, they are politically significant, and if maybe 2, maybe 3 of these 8 states went a different way in November, we would be having a different conversation.
She said, quote, "In some cases, we actually draft them for them, or have a sentinel on our behalf give them the model legislation so it has that grassroots from the bottom up type vibe." Take a look at some of these states that she talks about. Do you live in any of them? I live in Georgia. If you have time, I highly recommend reading the reporting from Mother Jones and viewing the leaked video from Documented. I'll put the links in the description. It's really quite disturbing when you hear it in its entirety. So now we'll get into the beginning of the Heritage Foundation, how it got started, who the major players were, and the political climate that made all of this possible. One thing to keep in mind before we get into it is if you don't want these guys making decisions about your life, know they are backed by the Heritage Foundation. Or if you don't want these people to try to put an end to public education who are also bankrolled by the Heritage Foundation, I hope you'll stay tuned for our series to understand why they are so dangerous for our democracy and use it as incentive to get out and help prevent Heritage Foundation approved legislatures and nonprofits from getting their far right-wing candidates elected. Now, let's get ready to dive into the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation has turned into a political machine that started in 1974 and rose quickly to influence current and former presidents, vice presidents, governors, members in Congress, and in the Senate, and are broadcast into the homes of millions of people around the country. So who is the Heritage Foundation? How do they affect me? To really understand how the Heritage Foundation can control your life, we need to go back to the past and understand the conditions that led to their creation and success as a conservative lobbying group and think tank. Alright, let's roll back to 1973. Picture it. Watergate was unraveling, the Vietnam War was winding down, and America was undergoing a cultural and political reckoning. Amidst all this, the Heritage Foundation was also born in 1973. We'll be jumping back and forth in time. Trust and bear with me, it'll all come together in the end. I mentioned earlier that we need to understand the organization, the economic, political, and the social climates of the time, and how they work together to sow the conditions that birthed the Heritage Foundation and allowed it to flourish. Understanding who planted the seed and the conditions for it to grow also tells us a story, one where you can see a lot of connections between then and our current political climate. To begin, three men stand out in the origin story: Paul Weyrich, Edwin Fielner, and Joseph Coors. Yes, that Coors. But before we look at these guys, let's take a look at what was going on in the US politically during the 1960s and early 1970s. In the 1960s, there was a movement that pushed for the idea of population control. Keep in mind that this is a really simplistic explanation of the population control ideas and concerns that could fill up an entire other video, but here's the general idea. At the time, a report showed that the Earth could not sustain as many people as it had much longer at the current population growth rate. In response, people and organizations went to great lengths to advocate and raise awareness for population control. President Johnson even said in 1968, "The population crisis is the greatest problem humanity faces." John D. Rockefeller's foundation and the Ford Foundation spent millions advocating, building pregnancy clinics, and innovating birth control to help with the project. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that the Rockefellers and the Fords were also interested in this movement because it helped support their beliefs in eugenics. That's also another entire video topic. It's important to consider that at the beginning of the 1960s, abortion and birth control were not nearly as polarizing as they are now. They weren't entirely on the radar of many religious organizations either. Congress and then Richard Nixon were eventually lobbied by Ford and the Rockefeller Foundation, passed and signed into law a commission that would research and study various elements of population control and what the country could do, if needed, to help the situation. The bill passed through Congress and President Nixon signed it into law. The image on the left shows him signing it with prominent supporters of the bill from both houses of Congress. The Rockefeller Foundation even supported initiatives for population control internationally and sent a population council to Korea. In these photos, women are string lubing IUDs to make these devices for women worldwide. Margaret Sanger also appears in this story. Sanger popularized the term birth control and opened the first birth control clinic in the United States and established organizations that evolved into Planned Parenthood Federation of America. As a side note, the Rockefeller Foundation significantly financed her work secretly. They shared similar eugenics beliefs and population control measures. One of the members of her board was also very interested and supported eugenics initiatives. The Population Growth Commission published this report in 1972, where it provided several recommendations, which, keep in mind, was the whole point of the study, which included increasing public knowledge on population change, supporting human reproduction information, and enabling individuals to avoid unwanted fertility. It even advocated for funding abortions. As you can imagine, the report was received as a declaration of war against American culture and American values, which required a significant shift in American groupthink to even be considered. The New York Times reported that Richard Nixon, who once said that the commission was critical, is quoted as saying, quote, "The proposal for liberalized abortion laws is an unacceptable means of population control." The resulting population report became such a polarizing topic that CBS wouldn't allow scientists and population experts to pay for airtime for a documentary. Dr. Stanton, a population expert close to the study, disclosed that CBS rejected a request from Mr. Rockefeller's Commission on Population Growth and American Future to purchase an hour of primetime to prevent its version of its report. Stanton also stated, quote, CBS demands that such material be chosen based on its entertainment or artistic merits only, and that it does not reflect any attempt to construct a program representing any particular editorial point of view. So in a way, the study was a factor in helping usher in the backlash of the anti-abortion movement and thus leading to the creation of the Heritage Foundation. Another element of the time to look at is the religious organization movements. At the time, the Catholic Church did not take a strong stance against abortion. They were more concerned about other social issues. They focused more on social issues like world hunger and poverty. Key figures such as Archbishop John Dearden and Reverend Joseph Bernardin, who's featured in this photo on the left, played pivotal roles in steering the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, also known as the NCCB, towards progressive agendas. Bernardin established an infrastructure rooted in liberation theology and community organizing. The image on the right was a conference brochure that now Cardinal Bernardin was hosting, which would attempt to guide the church towards this agenda. Paul Weyrich had criticized the church for not taking a harsher stance on abortion, and it appeared to him that they didn't seem to make it a priority at all. Weyrich also critiqued the Catholic establishment for its long-standing alignment with the American left wing, as a lot of demographic strongholds were Catholic. When Joseph Bernardin passed away a year later, this agenda was quickly changed, helped along by Paul Weyrich and James T. McHugh, at the request of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, which gave Paul Weyrich the opportunity to attempt to sway the political leanings of the church towards the conservative agenda. This was because, as far as the major religious groups, the Catholics had already built out an infrastructure for working against abortion, most notably the National Right to Life Committee, which was started in 1968 by Monsignor James T. McHugh at the request of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. At the same time, it's important to note that at this point, no major Protestant groups were on record as opposing abortion, with only sporadic instances at the individual level. Some were even supportive of the regulations at the time. The Southern Baptist Convention, the nation's largest Protestant denomination, passed a resolution at its 1971 annual meeting affirming the sanctity of life, but also calling on Southern Baptists to work for legislation that would allow for abortion in some cases of rape, incest, fetal deformity, and the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. Remember this part for a little bit later. Another side note to keep in mind for later is that Paul Weyrich wasn't concerned with your label. If you agreed with his agenda, he wanted to work with you, whether you were Protestant, Catholic, Republican, or Democrat. Quote, I'm willing to work with anybody that's willing to do the right thing from my perspective. I also can't take the position that because somebody did something that I don't like, I will refuse to work with them, because if I did that, I would have nobody to work with. We'll see evidence of this in just a few minutes. Also at the same time, a burgeoning pro-life movement was gradually starting to integrate itself with the Republican Party through Paul Weyrich's influence. Weyrich also started a relationship with Jerry Falwell, who was a Baptist leader, hoping that the evangelicals would mobilize on the issue and bring it into the social consciousness of the average individual, who would end up helping Ronald Reagan get elected. The teamwork of the Catholic and Protestant groups marked a pivotal turning point for the movement, as it breathed new life and energy into it. Almost 50 years later, there is a stark contrast between the two groups. So now we have the political climate of the time, and now we're getting into Paul Weyrich's career and the lead up to his creation of the Heritage Foundation. But where did this guy come from? Weyrich is originally from Racine, Wisconsin. His father, Ignatius Weyrich, immigrated from Germany in search of a better life. His father found work at St. Mary's Hospital in Racine, Wisconsin, where he remained loyal due to the support he had received during the Depression. His father heavily influenced Paul's worldview, with perspective rooted in early 20th century German Catholic values, emphasizing fiscal responsibility and the skepticism of socialism and communism. Naturally, the Republican Party was a better fit for his ideology, but he did not feel that they did enough for conservative principles. Paul Weyrich would also earn the title founding father of the conservative movement. He would also coin the term the moral majority. He would also be famous for the speech in which he said the quiet part out loud before it was cool.
I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
He said this in 1980 at a religious right meeting in Dallas, Texas. Paul Weyrich started the Heritage Foundation in 1973 to mimic the Democrats' strategy in winning elections. The Democrats had the Brookings Institute, which provided information and data to help assess legislation and provide members of Congress with research to help make critical decisions. The Heritage Foundation would be a think tank to provide academic assistance to the conservative congressman, regardless of political party, that is, in the beginning. Paul Weyrich was the face and worked with the members of Congress to lobby for conservative legislation. Joseph Coors provided the seed money of $200,000 to get the Heritage Foundation running, from whom Weyrich would meet by complete happenstance. Edwin Fuellner was the brains and brought the research, education, and academic elements to the Heritage Foundation. We'll get to Coors and Fuellner later on. With the Heritage Foundation in its infancy, and before the 1976 elections, Weyrich declared that a Carter victory would be a blessing in disguise for conservatives because it would kill the Republican Party as a viable political institution and foster a new conservative party. And Carter does win the 1976 election, giving Weyrich a few years to get started, get to work, get his agenda underway. The hope was that by the 1980 election, Weyrich's plan would work and get Reagan elected and a conservative agenda on the road to passing. Weyrich begins his work by creating a system and philosophy which he called the inside-outside operation, and it had four main components. 1. The inside-inside. The idea is to develop a network of high-level Capitol Hill staffers from the inside of Congress who communicated accurate, timely advance warning about what legislation was moving ahead, what hearings were being planned, when votes were being scheduled, and which members of Congress were leaning in which direction and why. The inside took the form of the Republican Study Committee in the House of Representatives and the Senate Steering Committee in the other chamber. The Heritage Foundation was founded as the outside think tank part of this operation. In 1970, Weyrich organized the Conservative Luncheon Club so that the conservative staff members could get acquainted with one another. A list preserved in his 1970 scrapbook names 13 men as founders and officers from both Democratic and Republican offices. 2. The outside-inside. This is where the Heritage Foundation comes into play. It would be a team of intellectuals, academics, and writers ready and able to react quickly to the information from the inside. They were able to produce reliable research, critiquing proposals, or promoting alternatives, finding expert witnesses to testify at hearings, and getting all of this information and these ideas into the hands of the media and onto the desk of members of Congress at the right time. 3. Elections. Majority of members of Congress who would vote right. Now hold on, this might take a few minutes to explain. This meant winning elections and winning them fairly, reliably, and strategically, which also meant putting the election piece of the operation into place, and required many steps and multiple election cycles. Many have said that the right has waited decades to get its full agenda into place by letting all the right pieces fall into place. And this is some evidence that they were right. To accomplish this, Weyrich first had to prove that being able to use a pro-life stance would not doom a candidate to defeat, which was, and frequently still is, the default position held by the political establishment. To prove that, he had to raise money, train the candidate, help them win, and then repeat the process over and over again. To accomplish this part, Weyrich started to implement a strategy he started to develop in 1971. Weyrich developed his 5 and 30 concept, meaning 5 active, articulate leaders in Congress are worth more than 30 ordinary votes. When a candidate came onto his radar, Weyrich would decide if it was worth his time and money to quote-unquote train this candidate to be one of the conservatives to vote quote-unquote the right way, preferably out of principle, but at least out of fear of adverse consequences to their re-election. Weyrich founded a conservative PAC, the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, the CSFC, and set out to do on the right what the NCEC, the National Committee for Effective Congress, did on the left. The CSFC would be different from anything that the political world had ever seen before. First, it published scorecards. The Conservative Register, a book-length scorecard of the entire Congress, with more than 800 record votes on a wide range of topics, which was mailed out to millions of Americans. Today it's kind of hard to imagine campaign politics without voter scorecards, but Paul Weyrich created the first one on the right. After a few years, the CSFC stopped doing this, as plenty of other groups had picked up on the technique. Second, he would not help incumbent candidates because he was only looking for new blood, motivated by principle and with leadership potential. He figured a member of Congress ought to be smart enough to use the perks of the office to get reelected. He's famous for saying, "I don't waste time with losers." Third, he would pick a side in a primary election, supporting the pro-life candidate regardless if it was the incumbent or not. He trained conservatives on how to win so that they could get themselves elected and then re-elected and thus achieve seniority in Congress. The system covered all aspects of campaign technology, including the innovative use of hard voter data, and focused on shoe leather politics, lots of direct contact between the candidate and the public. Weyrich believed that elections could be won by making a clear contrast with one's opponent, and abortion was an issue where a clear contrast could easily be made. By mid-1975, Weyrich had traveled to a dozen states and identified 100 actual or potential candidates. In 20 states, he personally met with 35 of them and targeted 25 districts. The 1976 results were much better. CSFC supported 4 of the senators who won the election and 30 of the 80 House candidates who ran. Number 4, the real outside. This included organizing demonstrations, making phone calls, and in those days, sending letters to Congress on short notice. A grassroots organization that could make senators and congressmen afraid to vote wrong was an essential element because it demonstrated they had the power to deliver thousands of volunteers and activists who can do all of this at a moment's notice. They also developed a network of volunteers who could organize demonstrations to let members of Congress know that they were not pleased with how they voted on a particular issue. In short, they take funding, have people make political and social policy, use current and relevant data, and I say current and relevant with air quotes, and win in congressional and presidential elections. In 1979, at a trustees meeting of the Heritage Foundation, it was suggested by Jack Eckerd, former head of the GSA, General Services Administration, under General Ford, that the foundation draw up a conservative plan of action for the next presidential administration in January 1981. Robert Krepel proposed that the Heritage Foundation produce a manual to help policymakers cut the size of government and manage it more effectively. This was the birth of the Mandate for Leadership series. Mandate for Leadership is a series of books published by the Heritage Foundation, which were intended to serve as guidelines for reducing the size and scope of the federal government through specific policy recommendations. The books have traditionally been released to coincide with the incoming U.S. presidential administration starting with the Reagan administration in 1981. The latest edition was published in April of 2023, also known as Project 2025, a topic we will get into a whole series about in the upcoming videos. Both the Reagan and Carter campaigns were approached by the Heritage Foundation to discuss the project. However, they only received a reply from the Reagan-Bush campaign, solidifying the relationship between the GOP and the Heritage Foundation. But as a side note, Bill Clinton worked with them and took some of their legislative agenda very seriously. And that's also a whole other video. At the first meeting of his cabinet, Ronald Reagan passed out copies of the Mandate for Leadership, and many of the study's authors were recruited into the White House administration. In particular, the Reagan administration hired key mandate contributors William Bennett as chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities and later as Secretary of Education, and James G. Watts as Secretary of the Interior. According to the authors of the mandate, around 60% of the Mandate for Leadership's 2,000 proposals had been implemented or initiated by the end of Reagan's first year in office. And with Paul Weyrich by his side, Reagan signed an abortion bill into law, taking the pro-life stand that Weyrich desperately wanted to see, and where the Hyde Amendment takes root. And this is also where we see the relationship between religious groups bonded with the conservative politicians. So how did the Heritage Foundation get so big so quickly? Well, the answer is simple: funding. Joseph Coors provided the initial financial muscle to get the Heritage Foundation off the ground very quickly. Coors not only contributed financially, but also played a role in setting the tone for the Heritage Foundation's focus on free enterprise. As owner of a huge and successful company, he had a vested interest in promoting economic policies that aligned with his ideologies. So when he was approached by Weyrich with his conservative think tank idea, Coors gave him $200,000 immediately. And now he's probably rolling in his grave, but that's just a side note. Next up, Edwin Fielner. With a background in academia and a PhD in economics, Fielner became the intellectual cornerstone of the foundation. He served as its president for over 3 decades and played a pivotal role in directing its research and policy recommendations. Fielner believed that changing the course of the nation required more than just political maneuvering. It needed an intellectual foundation, and that's where his expertise came into play. As president, Fielner made the foundation more aggressive, market-driven, and less of an ivory tower, and began publishing easily accessed and concise studies. Within a year and a half of Fielner becoming president, Heritage's budget increased to $2.5 million and its donor pool grew to about $120,000. Under his leadership, Heritage ultimately grew to 250 employees and with an annual income of about $80 million and a donor pool of about $600,000, one of the world's largest think tanks. By focusing on the foundation's marketing, he helped transform Heritage from a small operation into a booming enterprise of conservative ideals, eventually creating the think tank that Newt Gingrich called the Parthenon of the conservative metropolis. Whew, that was a lot of information. So let's end there for now. I hope you're able to get a sense of what we're working with as we talk about the insanity of Project 2025. I really felt it was important to lay down the foundation because it holds a lot of parallels to politics today, and you can really start to connect the dots on why MAGA politicians do the things they do and vote the way they do in Congress. If you're interested in what sources I used, I'll have the list linked in the description so you can check on some of this information or expand on it yourself. I'll also be posting the first installments of what Project 2025 is in the next couple of days, and we can process that level of crazy together. Thanks so much for watching, and hit like and subscribe before you go. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again. See you all soon. Bye!